During the World War II, relations between China and the United States evolved from limited military cooperation into a formal military alliance against Japan. Before the United States entered the war, China had already been fighting Japan since 1937 in the Second Sino-Japanese War. American public opinion gradually became sympathetic to China's struggle, especially after reports of Japanese atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the United States began providing aid to China. One famous example was the volunteer air unit known as the Flying Tigers, commanded by Claire Lee Chennault. They helped defend Chinese cities and supply routes from Japanese air attacks. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor attack, China and the United States became full allies. China was recognized as one of the big four allied powers alongside the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. American support included Lend-Lease military aid, training and equipped Chinese troops, construction and protection of supply routes such as Burma Road, air transport operations over the Hump after Japanese forces cut off land routes. However, the relationship was not always smooth. American commanders often criticized corruption and inefficiency, while the Chinese government, Chiang Kai-shek, meanwhile, Chiang believed some American officials underestimated China's sacrifices and strategic importance. Another complication was the ongoing rivalry between Chiang's nationalists and the Chinese communists led by Mao Zedong. The United States primarily supported Chiang's government, but also observed and sometimes communicated with communist forces operating against Japan. By the end of the war in 1945, China emerged as one of the victorious Allied powers and gained a permanent seat in the newly created United Nations Security Council. Yet the wartime alliance didn't survive for long. Soon after Japan's defeat, the Chinese Civil War resumed, eventually leading to the communist victory in 1949 and a dramatic deterioration in US-China relations during the early Cold War. Part 1. The Unlikely Alliance: How China and America Found a Common Cause. When people think of China-US relations today, rivalry, trade disputes, military competition, and geopolitical tension usually comes to mind. Yet, during the Second World War, the two countries stood on the same side of history. Long before American soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy or fought across the Pacific Islands, China was already locked in a brutal struggle against Imperial Japan. By the time the United States formally entered the war in December 1941, China had been fighting alone for more than 4 years. The roots of this wartime partnership were forged in crisis. In 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident escalated into a full-scale war between Japan and China. Japanese forces rapidly captured major Chinese cities, forcing the government of General Chiang Kai-shek to retreat deep into the interior. What followed was one of the most devastating campaigns of the 20th century. Cities were bombed, industries destroyed, and millions of civilians displaced. Across the Pacific, the United States initially remained neutral. American leaders were reluctant to become entangled in another overseas conflict after the trauma of the First World War. Yet public sympathy for China steadily grew. Reports from missionaries, journalists, and diplomats painted a grim picture of Japanese military actions. Events such as the Nanjing Massacre shocked American audiences and helped shape a perception of China as a victim struggle against aggression. At the same time, strategic calculations were beginning to change. American policymakers increasingly viewed Japanese expansion as a threat not only to China but to the balance of power through Asia and the Pacific. A Japanese-dominated East Asia would challenge American interests, commerce, and security. As a result, support for China gradually became a means of containing Japan without direct military intervention. By the late 1930s, the foundation of a wartime partnership were already being laid. Economic assistance began flowing to China, diplomatic ties strengthened, and American officials started searching for ways to help keep China in the fight. Neither country could yet know that within a few years they would become formal allies in a global war that would reshape the 20th century. The alliance between China and the United States was not born from shared ideology or deep cultural understanding, it emerged from necessity. Both nations faced the same adversary and both recognized that the outcome of the war in Asia would influence the future of the world. What began as cautious support would soon evolve into one of the most important strategic relationships of the Second World War. Part 2, the Flying Tigers and American first steps into China's war. Before American troops officially entered the Second World War, a small group of volunteer pilots became the symbol of growing cooperation between China and the United States, known as the Flying Tigers. These American aviators arrived in China during one of the darkest periods of the war. Japanese forces controlled vast territories, Chinese cities were under constant attack, and the Chinese Air Force was struggling to survive. The Flying Tigers were officially called the American Volunteer Group and were led by Claire Lee Chennault, a retired U.S. Army Air Corps officer who had spent years studying Japanese air tactics. Convinced that Japan's apparent superiority could be challenged through innovative tactics and disciplined training, Chennault persuaded Chinese leaders to support the creation of an American voluntary force. Although the United States was still officially neutral, Washington quietly allowed pilots to resign from the military service and join the effort. Flying the distinctive shark-faced P-40 Warhawk fighters, the Flying Tigers quickly gained a reputation for effectiveness. They used speed, surprise, and teamwork to compensate for their numerical disadvantages. Their victories boosted Chinese morale at a time when positive news were rare. Newspapers across America celebrated their exploits, turning them into heroes long before the United States formally entered the war. The Flying Tigers represented more than a military unit. They symbolized the gradual transformation of American policy. The United States was moving from passive observation to active support. Economic sanctions against Japan were tightened, loans and military assistance to China increased, and American leaders became increasingly convinced that a confrontation with Japan was becoming unavoidable. Meanwhile, China viewed American assistance as a lifeline. The Chinese government desperately needed aircraft, weapons, vehicles, industrial supplies. Every successful mission flown by the Flying Tigers demonstrated that Japan was not invincible. Their presence also reassured Chinese leaders that the United States was becoming more committed to their struggle. Everything changed on December 7, 1941. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor transformed a regional conflict into a global war. Overnight, the United States became a direct participant in the fight against Japan. China was no longer a distant recipient of aid, but a formal ally in a common war effort. The Flying Tigers had served as a bridge between neutrality and alliance. And their story marked the beginning of a much larger partnership that would soon span continents, ocean, and entire theaters of war. Part 3, Pearl Harbor and the birth of formal alliance. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 transformed the relationship between China and the United States overnight. For years, China had fought Japan largely alone, absorbing immense losses while hoping that foreign powers would eventually intervene. With a single surprise attack, that hope became reality, and the war China had been fighting since 1937 was now fully connected to a global conflict. When the United States declared war on Japan, China immediately became one of America's most important allies in Asia. For President Franklin D. Roosevelt, keeping China in the war became a strategic priority. Every Japanese soldier deployed against Chinese forces was a soldier unavailable for operations elsewhere in the Pacific. As long as China continued resisting, Japan would remain tied down across a vast front stretching thousands of kilometers. American planners understood the significance of this reality. China possessed enormous territory and a massive population and a strategic position at the heart of East Asia. Although China's military capabilities were limited compared to the major industrial power, its ability to absorb and sustain resistance against Japan made it a critical component of Allied strategy. A Chinese collapse would allow Japan to redirect substantial forces against American and British positions throughout Asia and the Pacific. For Chiang Kai-shek, the alliance offered opportunities that seemed impossible only a few years earlier. American military aid expanded dramatically. Weapons, trucks, aircrafts, communication equipment, and financial assistance began flowing into China. American advisors arrived to help reorganize and train Chinese units. Joint planning staffs were established, and Chinese leaders gained direct access to Allied decision making at the highest levels. Diplomatically, China's status rose as well. Roosevelt championed the idea that China would be recognized as one of the world's major power. Alongside the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, China became one of the so-called Big Four powers leading the Allied coalition. This recognition elevated China's international standing far beyond its military strength and reflected Roosevelt's vision of post-war order stabilized by several major powers rather than dominated by traditional European empires. Yet, beneath the public displays of unity, challenges were already emerging. American officials often underestimated the difficulties facing China after years of invasion, economic disruption, and internal political conflict. Chinese leaders, meanwhile, sometimes viewed American expectations as unrealistic. Both sides needed each other, but both also carried frustrations and suspicions that would become more visible as the war progressed. For the moment, however, those tensions remained secondary. The attack on Pearl Harbor had created a common enemy and a common mission. China and the United States were now bound together in a struggle that stretched from the mountains of western China to the islands of the Pacific, and the success of that alliance would become a crucial factor in the defeat of Imperial Japan. Part 4. The lifeline of China, supply routes, the hump, and the battle of logistics. An alliance is only as strong as its ability to move men, weapons, and supplies. For China and the United States, one of the greatest challenges of the war was not defeating Japan directly, but simply keeping China supplied. Geography became a battlefield of its own. Logistics emerged as one of the defining struggles of alliance. By 1942, Japan controlled much of China's coastline and many of its major ports. Traditional supply routes had become severed. The situation became even more dangerous when Japanese offensives in Burma cut off the famous Burma Road, one of the last major land connections between China and the outside world. With the road closed, China faced the prospect of strategic isolation. The United States responded with one of the most ambitious air transport operations in military history. Allied aircraft began flying supplies from India over the eastern Himalayas into China. Pilots called this route the Hump. The name sounded harmless, but the reality was anything but. Crews faced towering mountain peaks, violent storms, frequent freezing temperatures, poor navigation equipment, the constant threat of mechanical failure. Many aircraft never returned. Some disappeared into clouds and mountains. Others crashed after encountering severe weather. The Himalayas became a graveyard for transport planes. Yet, despite these dangers, thousands of fighters continued. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, and the military equipment crossed mountains in a continuous stream that kept China's war effort alive. For American commanders, these operations represented an extraordinary logistical achievement. For Chinese leaders, they were a necessity for survival. Every crate delivered across the hump strengthened China's ability to resist Japanese pressure. Every successful flight demonstrated the growing commitment of the United States to the alliance. At the same time, engineers and military planners sought more permanent solutions. Efforts began to reopen land routes through Burma, leading to fierce campaigns in difficult jungle terrain. American, British, Chinese, and local forces fought not merely for territory but for roads. In many cases, capturing a mountain pass or clearing a jungle corridor was more strategically vulnerable than taking a steady city because it restored the flow of supplies. These logistical struggles revealed an important truth about wartime alliance. Victory would not be determined solely by dramatic battles or famous generals. It would also depend on transportation networks, engineering projects, warehouses, fuel depots, and cargo aircraft. The ability to sustain China in the war became a strategic objective in its own right. As the conflict continued, American aid grew larger and more sophisticated, but increased assistance also brought increased scrutiny. Questions emerged about how resources were being used, how effectively Chinese forces were fighting, and whether the alliance was achieving its goals. These concerns would create tensions that exposed the deeper complexities hidden beneath the partnership between China and the United States. Part 5. Chiang Kai-shek, American generals, and the growing friction within the alliance. From a distance, the alliance between China and the United States appeared solid. Both nations were fighting Japan, both depended on each other, and both publicly emphasized unity. Yet, beneath closed doors, disagreements were becoming increasingly severe. By the middle years of the war, some of the most intense battles were not being fought against Japan, but within the Allied partnership itself. At the center of this tension stood Chiang Kai-shek. As the leader of the Chinese nationalist government, Chiang carried enormous responsibilities. He commanded a nation exhausted by years of warfare and economic collapse, as well as facing a refugee crisis and internal political divisions. His primary objective was not simply defeating Japan. He also had to think about what would happen after the war ended. This calculation often placed him at odds with American commanders. Many American officials wanted aggressive offensives against Japanese forces. They believed China should commit more troops to large scale operations and demonstrate greater military initiative. From their perspective, China was receiving significant aid and should be contributing more actively to the Allied war effort. Chiang saw the situation differently. He knew that another conflict was waiting in the shadows. Even while Japan remained the main enemy, the Chinese Communist movement under Mao Zedong was expanding its influence across northern China. Chiang feared that if his best forces were exhausted fighting Japan, the communists would emerge from the war stronger than ever. Preserving military strength for the coming political struggle became an increasingly important consideration. These strategic differences produced constant friction with American military leaders, especially General Joseph Stilwell. Stilwell was a capable and energetic officer who became one of the most influential American figures in China. He frequently criticized the nationalist government, arguing that corruption, inefficiency, and poor leadership were undermining the war effort. He pushed for direct control over Chinese military operations and demanded sweeping reforms. Chiang viewed many of Stilwell's demands as unacceptable intrusions into Chinese sovereignty. From his perspective, American officers didn't fully understand China's circumstances. They saw military problems by often underestimated the political realities of governing a fragmented country that had endured decades of instability and invasion. The relationship gradually deteriorated. Reports sent back to Washington painted increasingly negative pictures of Chinese leadership, while Chinese officials grew suspicious of American intentions. Misunderstandings multiplied, trust eroded, and what had begun as a partnership based on shared necessity became strained by competing priorities and conflicting visions of strategy. Yet neither side could afford a complete breakdown. The United States still needed China to tie down Japanese forces, and China still depended heavily on American aid. This mutual dependence kept the alliance functioning despite growing frustration. Publicly, cooperation continued. Privately, however, many leaders on both sides were already questioning whether the partnership could survive beyond the war. These doubts would become even more significant as another force gained strength within China itself. While nationalists and Americans argued over strategy, Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists were quietly repositioning themselves for the future, preparing for a post-war struggle that would ultimately transform China's relationship with the United States forever. Part 6. Mao Zedong, the Communists, and America's growing dilemma. While the alliance between Chiang Kai-shek and the United States occupied most international attention, another political and military force was steadily expanding within China. Deep in the countryside, far from the diplomatic meetings and military headquarters of the nationalist government, Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party were building an alternative center of power. By the middle of the war, America's China policy had become increasingly complicated because there was no longer just one China to consider. The uneasy cooperation between the nationalists and the communists had been established through the Second United Front, a temporary arrangement intended to resist Japanese invasion. On paper, both sides were fighting the same enemy. In reality, mutual distrust remained intense. Decades of rivalry, ideological differences, and previous civil war had not disappeared simply because Japan had invaded. For Mao, the war against Japan was both a national struggle and a political opportunity. Communist forces expanded their influence in rural regions, organized local resistance networks, and established administrative structure across large areas of northern China. While nationalist armies often fought major conventional battles, communist forces relied heavily on guerrilla warfare, intelligence gatherings, sabotage, and political mobilization. American observers found themselves confronted with conflicting narratives. Nationalist officers portrayed the communists as the opportunists who were conserving strength for a future civil war rather than fully committing to the fight against Japan. Communist representatives, meanwhile, argued that they were carrying out effective resistance while the nationalist government suffered from corruption and declining political support. Seeking better information, American officials dispatched observers to communist-controlled territories. The most famous of this effort was the Dixie Mission, which brought American military and diplomatic personnel into direct contact with communist leaders. For many of the Americans involved, the experience challenged assumptions they had held about Chinese political landscape. Some visitors reported that Chinese communist-controlled areas appeared more disciplined, organized, and responsive than expected. Others remained skeptical, warning that the movement's revolutionary ideology could eventually place it in direct conflict with American interests. Washington received a stream of contradictory assessments, making it increasingly difficult to determine how the United States would position itself for China's future. This uncertainty created a strategic dilemma. The United States remained committed to Chiang Kai-shek as the internationally recognized leader of China. American aid, diplomatic support, and military cooperation continued to flow primarily to the nationalist government. Yet, some American officials began questioning whether Chiang's regime would remain dominant after the war ended. For Mao and the Communist Party, these years were transformative. The movement emerged from war significantly stronger than it had entered. Members expanded, territorial control increased, and political influence spread throughout large portions of the countryside. Every year after that the war continued gave the communists more time to consolidate their positions. By 1945, American policymakers faced an uncomfortable reality. Their wartime ally was deeply divided internally, and the question of who would rule China after Japan's defeat remained unresolved. What had begun as a straightforward alliance against the common enemy was evolving into a far more complex geopolitical challenge. As victory over Japan approached, the fundamental issue could no longer be ignored. The war that had temporarily united China's competing faction was nearing its conclusion. Once Japan was defeated, the fragile truce between nationalists and communists would almost certainly collapse, forcing the United States to confront one of the most consequential decisions in the modern diplomatic history. Part 7. Victory, Global Status, and China's Place Among the Great Powers. As the Second World War moved towards its conclusion, China stood in a position few observers would have predicted in 1937. After enduring 8 years of invasion, devastation, and immense human suffering, the country emerged on the victorious side of the conflict. Despite its internal weaknesses and economic hardships, China had remained in the fight from the first shots of the war against Japan to the final surrender. The endurance earned it a place among the world's leading powers. For Franklin D. Roosevelt, China's role extended beyond the battlefield. He envisioned a post-war international order maintained by several major powers working together to preserve global stability. In his framework, China would serve as the pillar of security in Asia, balancing future threats and helping prevent another catastrophe. This vision elevated China's diplomatic standing to unprecedented levels. Along the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, China became one of the principal allied powers shaping the post-war settlement. Chinese representatives participated in major international conferences, and the country's leadership gained a voice in discussions about the political future structure, about the future political structure of the world. Perhaps the most important symbol of the new status came in 1945 with the creation of the United Nations. China was granted a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, placing it among the small group of nations entrusted with maintaining international security and peace. For a country that had spent decades battling internal instability, foreign intervention, and economic hardship, this achievement was remarkable. Yet beneath the celebration, serious problems remained unresolved. China's economy was exhausted, inflation was spiraling out of control, infrastructure lay in ruins. Millions of civilians had been displaced from years of war. Vast regions required reconstruction, and government institutions faced enormous challenges in restoring normal administration. The military situation was equally fragile. Japanese forces were surrendering, and the political struggle between nationalists and communists were intensifying. Both sides rushed to occupy strategic territories vacated by the Japanese. What appeared to be victory over foreign invasion increasingly resembled the beginning of a new internal conflict. American officials watched these developments with growing concern. During the war, the alliance had been held together by the necessity of defeating Japan. With that objective achieved, the underlying political divisions within China moved to the forefront. Washington hoped that a negotiated settlement might prevent another civil war, but events on the ground were moving rapidly in the opposite direction. The irony was striking. At the very moment China reached its highest international status in modern history, its domestic political order was approaching a decisive crisis. The nation that had just become one of the world's recognized great powers was also on the verge of a struggle that would determine its future for generations. The wartime alliance between China and the United States has succeeded in helping defeat Japan. However, the peace that followed would reveal the victory in war didn't guarantee political stability. The next chapter would test whether the partnership forged in World War II could survive in a world where the common enemy had disappeared. Part 8. The collapse of the alliance and the road to the Cold War. When Japan formally surrendered in September 1945, celebrations erupted across the world. For the United States and China, victory marked the successful conclusion of years of cooperation against a common enemy. Yet the alliance that had helped shape the outcome of the war was already beginning to unravel. The end of the conflict exposed another that had merely been postponed. Almost immediately after Japan's defeat, the fragile truce between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists began to break down. Negotiations were attempted, ceasefires were declared, and the American diplomats worked intensively to prevent renewed civil war. But the fundamental political differences separated the two sides were too deep. Each believed that it alone possessed the legitimacy and strength to govern China. The United States found itself in a difficult position throughout the war. Washington had recognized Chiang Kai-shek's government as a legitimate government of China. American policymakers had to invest enormous resources in supporting the nationalists, yet many assumed that they would remain dominant after the war. Yet, reality proved far more complicated. The nationalist government faced mounting challenges. Years of warfare had weakened the economy. Inflation eroded public confidence, and corruption damaged the regime's credibility. Many Chinese citizens who had supported resistance against Japan became increasingly frustrated with the government's inability to address domestic problems. Meanwhile, the communists entered the post-war period stronger than they had ever been. Their organizational networks had expanded during the war. Their influence in rural regions had grown, and their leadership projected as image of discipline and purpose. As fighting resumed, communist forces demonstrated increasing military effectiveness against nationalist armies. American leaders struggled to determine how deeply they should become involved. Some argued that a stronger support to prevent a communist victory would be applicable. Others questioned whether additional aid could fundamentally change the outcome. The debate reflected a broader uncertainty about China's political future and America's ability to influence events within such a vast and complex country. By 1949, the answer had become clearer. Communist forces achieved decisive victories across the mainland. Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of People's Republic of China in Beijing, while Chiang Kai-shek and the remnants of the nationalist government retreated to Taiwan. One of the most significant political transformations of the 20th century had taken place. For the United States, the outcome represented the collapse of many wartime assumptions. A country that had been celebrated as a major allied partner was now governed by a communist regime aligned, at least initially, with the Soviet bloc. Within a few years, former wartime cooperation would give way to strategic hostility, ideological confrontation, and eventually direct military opposition during the Korean War. The wartime alliance between China and the United States had been built on a shared objective, defeating Imperial Japan. Once that objective disappeared, the political realities that had been temporarily overshadowed re-emerged with full force. The partnership didn't survive the peace. In the end, World War II remains one of the most fascinating periods in the history of US-China relations. For a brief moment, two nations that would later become rivals stood together against a common enemy. Their cooperation helped shape the outcome of the war and influenced the creation of a post-war international order and altered the course of modern history. Yet it also demonstrated a timeless lesson for geopolitics. Alliances are often products of circumstances, and when those circumstances change, even the strongest partnership can rapidly transform into competition. Part 9. Legacy: How the Wartime Alliance Still Shapes US-China Relations Today. More than 8 decades have passed since American and Chinese forces fought on the same side during the Second World War. The world has changed dramatically, empires have disappeared, the Cold War has come and gone. China has risen from a war-torn nation into one of the world's most powerful states. Yet the legacy of that wartime alliance continues to influence how both countries understand themselves and each other. In the United States, World War II is often remembered as a period when China was viewed as a courageous partner resisting aggression. Images of the flying tigers, supply flights over the Himalayas, and the sacrifices of Chinese civilians became part of broader Allied narrative. Many Americans saw China as a key contributor to the defeat of Japan, and as a nation observing a prominent place in the post-war era. In China, the memory is far more complex. The war against Japan occupies a central place in modern Chinese historical consciousness. It is remembered as a struggle for national survival and a turning point in the country's path towards reunification and eventual resurgence. The contributions of foreign allies, including the United States, are acknowledged, but the emphasis is often placed on China's own endurance and sacrifices after years of invasion and occupation. These different historical perspectives matter because nations frequently interpret current events through the lens of past experiences. American leaders often recall periods of cooperation and assume that strategic partnerships can rebuild when interests align. Chinese leaders, meanwhile, frequently emphasized the importance of sovereignty, national independence, and avoiding dependence on external powers. Both viewpoints are shaped in part by lessons drawn from the wartime era. The alliance also left institutional legacies. China's position as a permanent member of the United States Security Council traces directly back to the decisions made by the two powers during the Second World War. The recognition China received as one of the principal allied powers helped establish its role in the international system that still exists today. Even as governments changed and ideologies shifted, their status remained. Perhaps the most enduring lesson concerns the nature of international politics itself. The wartime partnership between China and the United States was not based on permanent friendship, it was based on convergence of interests. Both countries faced a powerful common enemy, and cooperation offered advantages neither could achieve alone. Once the strategic environment changed, the alliance weakened and eventually disappeared. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Nations cooperated when interests overlap and compete when interests diverge. World War II provides one of the cleanest examples of this principle. The same countries that had collaborated against Japan later found themselves separated by ideology, military rivalry, and competing visions of the world order. Understanding this history provides valuable context for the present. Contemporary tensions between China and the United States often appear unprecedented, yet the relationship has always been more complicated than simple friendship to rivalry. It has moved through periods of cooperation, confrontation, accommodation, and competition. The wartime alliances was one chapter in a much longer story, and that story remains unfinished. The same two countries that had once coordinated military operations across Asia now shape global debates on trade, technology, security, and international governance. The circumstances are different, the leaders are different, the world is different, but the central question remains remarkably familiar. When great powers interact with common interest, When great powers interact, will common interests prove stronger than competing ambitions? The answer to that question helped define the 20th century. It may also help define the 21st.